See, out in California, everybody responds back, "Good morning, Jim." It's amazing what different cultures we have just in ecclesial life. I got to apologize first to Stephen for having you read Ezra 10. I have to admit, in my family, when we get to that point, we like turn on Bible Gateway and listen to Max McLean, who's a Jew, read them, and he just like slides right through them all because I don't even want to read them myself. But I'm sorry, I forgot about the list at the end. I would have rather had you count them than read them, because I think it's a lot more important that we count the names than it is to read them. But anyways, thank you very much for doing that. I do appreciate that. All right, so because of time constraints and so on, we are going to do a little skipping along in Ezra. I would have loved to spend more time on Ezra showing up in chapter 7. He does show up in the 7th year of King Darius, which he calls Artaxerxes, which makes a lot of sense that as soon as he heard the temple was finished in the 6th year, he then came back with a whole group of people ready to operate in the temple. That's what he came back to do. He came back the next year in the 7th year. And in chapter 8, you get to read about all that great preparation that he did. He didn't just show up on the scene and expect to like take off and do it. He prepared. And he prepared properly to be an ecclesial leader. But when you get to chapters 9 and 10, they're really all about a challenging issue for all of us. How do we make decisions in ecclesial life, in our family life, that are not short-term, based on, just what I want right now, but decisions that are based on the long run of wanting to make sure that we leave an inheritance for our children? That's what Ezra's prayer was about. It's different. Short-run decisions are just for the moment. You do like what works for now. And sometimes those are a lot easier. But long-term decisions, those are sometimes tough. They cost us. We don't all agree as a group when we get together. And you have to make decisions, as you saw with their decision here. Not everybody agreed with the decision. But they went with the majority who realized this was a good solution for the long term so that they would survive as a community and leave an inheritance for their children. So there's 2 tough decisions today that we're going to look at. We got marriage to unbelievers, which shouldn't have happened, but I think comes as the result of, we just looked at in the Sunday school class, what had happened was the Gentile nations around were witnessing what was happening with the Jews and couldn't believe how their God had provided for them so much. Some of those people were drawn, and very similar to like a Rahab, they were drawn to the community. And so outsiders were coming in, and they even ate the Passover with the Jews. And some of them were really committed, and some of them were not. And this is what you'll see happening as you read through Ezra 9 and 10. And the other issue is not just marriage to the unbelievers, but in the end, their decision involved divorce, which is one of those flag words in Christadelphia, right? Everybody gets nervous when you talk about divorce. But those are issues you have to face in family life and ecclesial life. And we can't just pretend they don't exist. We have to talk with them, reason out, get together as a group like they did, and come up with solutions. So my job today isn't to tell you what to do. What I would like to do this morning is try to understand how these people came up with their solution. How did they figure that all out? How did they, as a group, rationalize that this is a good choice and implement that choice? Now, you don't actually hear like in Acts 15 when they got together and they were trying to solve the problem of the Gentiles and the Jews, and it seemed good to us, like James would say, and to the Holy Spirit. You don't get that here in Ezra. So some of you end up walking away thinking, well, this was just their decision and it really wasn't a good one. But only a few years later, Nehemiah shows up and makes the same choice. They realized that to hold the community together, this big issue, it was going to take a big solution, a solution that cost and wasn't easy to implement. So I don't want to really tell you what to do in your ecclesias, and I don't even know what your ecclesial policies are, which is great when you show up from outside the area. But what I'd like you to try to understand is how they came up with this solution and why it worked for them. Then at least for the moment it did. How did they reason through this? Because my experience in ecclesial life has been all my life is that these Bible stories are written so that we have a basis for trying to understand how to make our decisions today. That is what has driven me away from my local ecclesial culture to like realizing, what does the Bible say? And the Bible comes up with different answers. I mean, you look at like even the prayer this morning for your thing. I looked at Lola and I said, does everybody stand up or sit down here? What do you do for prayers? Because, I grew up thinking like everybody had to stand up for all the prayers. And it was like, I thought that was the right thing to do. And then I'm reading the scriptures and finding out they don't stand up. They sit down. They get down on the grass. People got down on their hands and knees. The people you find standing up in the Bible in the New Testament are the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees who love to stand on the street corners and give their long prayers. And all of a sudden I realized like, wow, I'd inherited a cultural thing that really isn't even biblical. But there's so many things like that in our ecclesial life. And we have to constantly search the scriptures and weigh them out as to whether our local culture is a biblical idea or whether it isn't. And sometimes it doesn't even matter whether you stand up or sit down for a prayer. That's not a big issue, but other things matter. And it's important that we try to read these Bible stories and figure them out. So what happens in Ezra 9, as Steve read for us, that the officials approached Ezra. Ezra's back now, and they come to him and they say, we have a problem. The people, the priests, the Levites. That tells you this problem wasn't just in one little local area. It was scattered amongst the community at this point. It was a community-wide problem. And all of these different peoples were involved. They treated this really serious. And they understand this idea that why did the captivity happen in the first place? It was because the influences of the other Gentile nations, as the New King James calls them, the pagan wives, had come in with their gods, and the people now had those gods in their hearts, and God couldn't get it out of them, and he takes them off to captivity, and away they go. And some of the leaders realize we're going back and redoing again the same mistakes of the previous generations. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to make sure and protect that didn't happen. So I think you'll find that that's what had happened over time. Now these Gentiles had come in. Some of them were devoted Gentiles. So you can't just like cut them all off. And some of them were not devoted at all. You find in the time of Nehemiah that it actually says that when they were raising their children, they weren't even teaching them Hebrew anymore. And they realized that, wow, this is not a good long-term solution. So the key principle that he's dealing with here is that they had not separated themselves from the peoples of the land. And so they went to their Bibles and realized the Bible principle was you're supposed to separate. God had said in Exodus and Leviticus and so on, for you will be holy, for I am holy. You remember what happened when Nadab and Abihu offered unholy fire, and God brought in Leviticus 10 and 11 and 12 and 13, all those clean and unclean things. It was all so that they would recognize spiritually the difference between the clean and the unclean. He didn't want them to become like Nadab and Abihu and just do things the way they wanted to and offer their unholy fire. And he struck 2 of them dead. That was a drastic day. There were only 5 priests at that time, Aaron and his 4 sons. And now 2 of them are dead. They're down to 3. That was a big event at that time. And so God enacts provisions to protect those things from happening. He makes those kind of decisions. So they realized that their job was to separate from these peoples of the land. Leviticus 20 says, you shall distinguish between the clean and the unclean. I am the Lord your God who has separated you from the peoples. You shall be holy to me. And the mistake the Jews made with that was thinking as time went on that when God said that they were holy, that they were better than the Gentiles. You know, that can creep into our community as well today. You grow up in the Christadelphian community and you think, oh, we're better than the neighbor next door. We're better than those other kids at school. We're better than all these other people. And that was the mistake of the Jewish mind. They thought they were better and they didn't want to accept the Gentiles. That's what happened in the first century ecclesia. And what the Jews had failed to realize was that they're no better than everybody else out there. What was different about them is they were considered holy because God had separated them and God had chosen them and God had made them a special people. We're no better than the other people. That's why John the Baptist would say, if you guys don't get serious about this, God can of these stones raise up children to Abraham. And it's something we all have to take to heart, God's election. He makes the choice. He picks people. He chooses who he wants to invite in his family. And do we really think that the small little Christadelphian community are the only ones God can save in this world? I remember finally realizing at one point in my life that, wait a minute, when Christ returns, there's over 7 billion people on this planet. How many have we converted? A drop in the bucket. And when Jesus comes back, he's going to convert the very same people that we look around today and think, well, they're not holy. They're not part of us. They're not part of. He's going to change their hearts. He's going to save them. And many are going to die and resist. But think about it. Out of 7 billion, even if the ratio of Israel of 2/3 being cut off and 1/3 saved alive, you apply that worldwide, we're talking about almost 2 billion people are going to be converted. And we don't really know the numbers. But it's not like we're better. It's that God has chosen you. And in a few years, he's going to choose, or a few days, he's going to choose a whole lot more people out there and bring them into his family. So they had made the mistake of not separating themselves from all the nations that are around. And they had taken for themselves wives. Now, I do have to point out to you that sometimes you'll hear Christadelphians who have a preconceived idea about divorce, and they get to Ezra 10 and get very nervous about that and end up trying to concoct a story so that this isn't divorce. And this is one of the things I'll warn you about in holding on to cultural things. You then try to reread the scriptures and cover them up and treat them a different way. The words that are used in the Hebrew for put away your wives are the same words that are used in Deuteronomy 24 for the certificate of divorce. Put away your wives. This is definitely a story about marriage and divorce. They put away their wives. So they didn't just take foreign women and just live with them. God considered them married. So this is clearly a marriage issue. They had taken foreign wives, they had married them, and now they had joined themselves to the people of the land, or the holy race, as they put it, had mixed themselves with divided loyalties. And now this whole issue was coming up again. I'll tell you one of the most effective things I ever saw in our CYC back in Detroit years ago was about this issue, about marriage out of the truth. Was Brother Don Stiles was the leader at that time, and he brought in a brother who had married out of the truth, and his wife was not interested. So he had totally married an unbeliever. So I'm not talking about people who marry somebody who's a believer, who's a possibility of coming in, and maybe they're not Christadelphian yet, but they're a believer and they're interested in God. This person had married someone who had no interest in God. And he came in and he talked to our CYC. And he just leveled with us and said, here's what my life is like now, because I've married somebody who doesn't come to meeting, doesn't raise my children the way I'd like to. She takes them to another church, to First Sunday School, and she takes the money that I've earned and gives it to her church. And he listed all these different reasons, and he just leveled with us about what his life was like. And you start to realize that this is tough. It's hard when people do that. I still remember culturally growing up in Detroit, and the policy was if you married out of the truth, disfellowship, just like that. Automatic, it's a rule, disfellowship. And then I remember reading when Lebronics came out, reading back in the old Christadelphian magazines, and somebody wrote John Thomas. Remember tough John Thomas, right? They wrote him about what should we do with this brother who married out of the truth? And John Thomas replied, well, he's already made one mistake that's going to make his life difficult. Don't make it more difficult. Support him, help him, he's going to need it. I thought, wow, that's really different than what I had heard growing up. And it's just, these are the kinds of things, brothers and sisters, that affect people's lives. We don't want to get stuck in a cultural box limiting the possibilities for how we can help people. We want to keep looking at the scriptures to find out what kind of evidence and support and guidance is God giving us about how to handle this issue. So I found that at least myself very effective. And so did Sue, my wife. She still remembers that story, what had happened. That's probably 40 years ago. And we still remember to this day how much that impacted us in our CYC class. Because we've got to make good decisions like that, and we've got to provide an inheritance for our children. So look what they did in chapter 9. They rent their garments, in chapter 10, they're all trembling. They're coming over because they're worried about the future of the community. That's what's at stake right here. So at the evening sacrifice, at the time of the continual burnt offering in verse 5, this is when they should have been dedicating themselves. And Ezra, he gives a beautiful prayer, very much like the one we just had for the hall here. And he recounts all those wonderful things. He talks about humility that we should have and confesses our sins and God's kindness and mercy. And the whole purpose of freedom was that we could build a house to God, not just a physical building, but a spiritual house, a people. And this problem is going to get in the way of that. They acknowledged the people's failures, he did, and God had warned of this danger. And so Ezra, as you're reading through that prayer, you underline, you highlight all those words, R, O-U-R. He didn't say it's them. He said it's us. It's our problem. Look what we have done as a community. And it's giving us hints about how to handle problems. If you really are a member of an ecclesia or a family and a problem comes into it, we don't talk about them and us. It's all of us. It's part of us. It's our family. And we look for solutions to solve this for our family. So in chapter 10, we get the solution they picked. The people are weeping bitter in verse 1. It's, that's important that we treat it seriously. People cry to God. This is, things happen in families, and you go to prayer and God and you beg him to help your family. Very much we were looking at yesterday with Jacob when he's talking with that angel and wrestling with the angel, and he's crying with the angel because he needs the help of the angel. And that's part of what brings unity in this case, is that you come together, you pour out your hearts to God, you pray together and try to find those solutions. So look at who brings about the solution. I can imagine if you were doing this, there would have been in the whole group of people that had came from all over, there would have been people suggesting one thing, suggesting another thing, and all these ideas were being put out on the table. What are we going to do? And the only one we're told about is Shechaniah. Shechaniah. Now, why Shechaniah? Well, did you notice who his dad is? His dad is Jehiel. Did you notice where his dad shows up? It's in that list you read, Steve. That's why it was worth going through all those names, because he's in the list. This brother lived with the problem. His dad had married a foreign wife, and he saw the results of it in his own family. He had, by experience, witnessed what it was like to grow up in a mixed family like that. And so he comes up with a solution. All right, he's willing to admit the problem. We got a problem. I've seen it at home. This is what's happening. And his suggestion is that what we need to do is put away the foreign wives. We need to get this out of the community. What you learn from that, though, brothers and sisters, is that ecclesial unity, to maintain it, we have to all admit we have a problem. It doesn't do any good to point fingers. You don't do that in families. You might want to do that in ecclesias. People find it for some reason so much easier to treat the ecclesial members so different than they would treat their own children. Can you imagine doing that to your child? Those of you moms and dads, you love your kids, your grandkids. You're not going to single them out and talk about them versus me. You want to save them. You love them. And you realize we have a problem. It's a family problem, and we're going to try to solve it. But they came away with hope. There is hope. It's not lost. There's still a way of moving forward. We can do something with God's help that will solve this problem. And the solution is put away the foreign women and their children. Ooh, that's a tough one. And their children. It's the same word that's used in Deuteronomy 24. I'll say that again. This is clearly a marriage issue, and it's very clearly a divorce case. They're going to put them away. You go back and look at Deuteronomy 24. Why did God regulate divorce? It's an interesting question to ask Christadelphians because a lot of us have policies and positions about divorce. We have all this stuff we think we've accumulated. And when you read Deuteronomy 24, what comes to your mind right away? Why did God regulate Deuteronomy 24? Why did he regulate divorce? Why did he do it? And I remember being shocked as a kid, finally realizing that he did it to protect women. They didn't have child support back in those days. They didn't have help from the government back in those days. He understood we are going to have women who have 4 or 5 kids and their husband puts them away and they can't even survive. And he regulated it and said, you better give them a certificate of divorce because he assumed right away they would remarry. That's the assumption reading through Deuteronomy 24. And he even goes on to describe the fact, and when they remarry and have another husband, and if he puts her away, she can't come back to you. So before you write that certificate of divorce, you better think twice. This is the end. Is that really what you want to do? But if you do, I'm going to protect those women. I'm going to provide a future for them, an inheritance for them. I'm not going to put them out there and just say, somehow you survive and we can't take you back and there's no hope for you now. It's like God cared about these people. He loved them and he didn't want people mistreated. That's what God did. So their solution is to put away these wives and their kids. Now, I think what you're going to find as we go through this, that they put away the wives and the kids who still lived like foreigners. That's what this was really all about. And for those of you that think that this is some unusual case, you know Paul's counsel in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 7. They were Gentiles coming in. They had married women who didn't convert. They had spouses who really didn't want to be a part of the community. They were sometimes very antagonistic to that because they had a different culture they had grown up with. What does Paul tell a brother or sister who's married to an unbeliever, who is divisive and doesn't want to be a part of the community and would like to depart? He warns the ecclesial world, don't put pressure on them to stick together. If that person wants to leave, he says, let them depart because God has called us to peace. Peace. Did you ever realize that? That God cares more about the unity of the family, about the peace of raising godly children. He actually holds that higher than the whole issue of marriage. And I know we get out our passages and we say, well, God hates divorce. God hates divorce. Marriage is for life. But these people realize that, yes, that's true, but it doesn't always work. And there are things that are worse. And this is what they were experiencing. I think you'll see this is why they made these decisions. So then I started realizing, reading through the scriptures as a young person, as you're finally in your teens and you start reading for yourself and you realize, oh my goodness, what was the very first thing that God commanded the Israelites after he gave them the 10 commandments? Exodus 20, 10 commandments. What's the very first thing that he covers in Exodus 21? Do you know what that is? Exodus 21. He says, I know all of you have a cultural understanding of slavery that you inherited from Egypt. You're not going to do that with each other. That's not the way you're going to run slavery. God wasn't against slavery. He was against the way the Egyptians did it, and he wanted to make sure his community didn't operate slavery like that. So he said, when you had slaves, he gave them an entire way of dealing with slavery. So suppose that we have a brother here, and suppose you decide as a Hebrew brother, you want to sell yourself to me as a slave. So how long do you have to work as a slave? Well, no more than 6 years, right? 7th year, you go free. So suppose during that 6 years, maybe it's early on, first year, you're gonna live for 6 years as a slave for me. And what if I have a few girls that are slaves for me, and I decide to give one of them to you, and she's your wife, and she bears you children, and you get to the end of the 6 years, and you're like, yeah, the 7th year is coming. You're gonna be free. And you realize that, all right, in the 7th year, am I supposed to let him go? Exodus 21, do I let him go? Of course I had to. That's your freedom. You don't keep a Hebrew slave more than 6 years. The 7th year, everyone is set free to start over. But what about your wife and your 2 kids? Oh, see, I know what a lot of us would like to do. They'd like to say that, well, I would now lose that girl and the kids that were born to you because marriage is more important than master-slave relationship. Do you realize that's not what God says? See, I think sometimes we read the Bible and we don't even catch on to what's happening. God says, if you want to leave, you can leave, but I now still keep your wife and your kids. And the only way you can keep them is if you decide to be my slave for life. You can go to the judge, have your ear, what it gets there, that's where that whole story comes from. But you had the right to leave. And I couldn't stop that because God held the master-slave relationship more important than marriage. And I don't think really in our community, a lot of us even understand that. We don't really, what do you do with that? You know, because we know that God hates divorce, but there are times where he actually said that, well, there's other stuff that's more important. Or did you notice reading through Deuteronomy lately? Well, we get to 18 today. You're going to get to Deuteronomy 21, just coming up. When Israel conquered foreign nations, not nations in the land, but the foreign nations outside. So when they took care of Og and Sihon and all these other nations around Israel, and they conquered them, I remember really reading as a young person, I just like was shocked to read because of my culture that God says that, well, if you're out there and you're fighting in the war and you're one of the warriors, right? And well, you're not married yet, okay? So you're just a young guy and you get out there and you conquer these foreign nations, you kill all the men, but you see a girl that you really like and she looks beautiful and you want to take her home. Is that okay? She's a foreigner. Can you bring home a foreigner? Well, Deuteronomy 21, you're going to read it in a couple days. Yes, God says you can bring her home, but she's got to get rid of her fingernails, you know, maybe toenails too if they were painted. She got to shave her head. She's got to get rid of all that stuff that would have identified her with Canaan and all the foreign pagan gods. And she's got to adopt the community's position, the religion of a Jew. That's what she's got to do. And you had to wait a month. A whole month. And then you could marry her. Awesome, eh? I used to think like, that didn't fit my culture that I grew up with at all. I thought that was all wrong to do something like that. And here God allowed them to do that. And then the next part was even more shocking. Do you remember what happened if after a while you decide you don't like her? You find some indecency in her, as our Bible versions say. What happens if after a while you don't like her? There's something indecent, or maybe you find out she really doesn't want to convert. What can you do? I mean, you're married to her. What are you going to do? Our Bible says you set her free. Set her free. And God even put restrictions on it. He said, when you set her free, you can't sell her as a slave. Oh, normally you could do that with a foreign woman, but now that you've had her as a wife, you can't sell her as a slave, and you can't brutally treat her. You got to send her away nice. You send her away and take care of her. But see, these are the kind of things as a younger person, I go back and look at how did I change my culture? It's by carefully reading the scriptures and putting all the evidence together, not just one verse here and one verse there. You have to read all the evidence and try to compile it together to come up with solutions to these problems. And a lot of us don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. We want to adopt a culture and we want to stick with it and defend it to the end. And it harms our community. It harms our brethren and sisters. They're young people. We hurt people by our decisions sometimes. We're tough on people. We're like Saul of Tarsus, going out with the zeal of God with our Bibles and all our Bible verses, and we'll drag people into this position and impose it upon them. A position which God doesn't do. And that's, I think it's a huge warning from stories like this in Ezra chapter 10. Don't get caught up in that. So you read the New Testament and you find out, well, what does Christ do with this? You know, you wonder, like, I remember reading the story about the woman caught in adultery. He knew she was an adulterer. The law made it so clear adulterers are supposed to be stoned. How in the world did he rationalize that go away and sin no more? How do you do that? Those are the kind of things that struck me like, wow, that's different. Or what about when the Pharisees complained about shucking the grain on the Sabbath day? And he brings up Bible stories and he said, haven't you read? See, they should have read it. They should have known about it, but they threw it in the back of their minds and they didn't want to deal with it because it didn't fit the cultural view. Haven't you read what David did when his men were hungry? And Jesus spells it out. They did what was unlawful, and they ate of the showbread and were guiltless. That shocked me. It's like, that wasn't in my cultural box at all. How do you break the law and be guiltless? And you find out, well, wait a minute. Even though there was a law, you start to understand how God operates. Sure, he gives us laws, but as Jesus said, the laws were made for man, not man for the Sabbath. They're not written to impose all these restrictions so I can't help somebody. They're written to give us guidance for the general idea. But what do you do when somebody comes along who's hungry and they're starving and they've got no food and you got nothing to give them but the showbread? He held it out that it was more important to feed and love your brother than it was to hold on to this principle that nobody can eat the showbread but the priest. See, that's outside our cultural box, brothers and sisters. But we don't like those kind of things. They make us a little nervous. And it's like, ooh, I know what that's like. I went through this my whole life, constantly trying to figure out what's God trying to tell us, until I finally realized what he's trying to tell us is he cares more about the people than he does about these rules. He bends rules. He breaks them. He does things because he loves people and he cares about the people. It's the very thing that all of you would experience if you ever had a child. I've watched so many Christadelphians that had their cultural view of issues of adultery and divorce and marriage out of the truth and premarital sex and all these things that we develop. And then you watch what happens when they have a child who's a teenager who does that. And all of a sudden, the angels force you to revisit the issue. All of a sudden, instead of pointing fingers at them, it's like, oh, wow, we got a problem. What are we going to do about it? And I've just watched so many families change their cultural view when that happens. And it must be what angels do. They look around at our community. They look at us and figure out, what am I going to do to help Jim see this? How can I open his eyes and see beyond the culture he grew up in? And so they throw these events into our life to try to force us to re-examine the scriptures, look at them from a different mindset. And that's what happened in this story. So the solution they came up with was to divorce these women, put away the wives and the kids. Now, here again, you can read through that as a surface view, all right? And you look at this and say, well, that's what they did. They just got rid of them all. And then you realize that, oh, thank you very much. See, thank you. See, that's an issue I have a lot of trouble with. My wife looks around all the time and Sue sees, she reads people and she always notices what people need. And I got to admit, I'm not very good at that. I walk in and I just don't even notice things. Thank you very much. But that's why God's given me the children I have. So I start to learn about understanding and being compassionate about the needs of other people. So what they do in 3 days, they're supposed to gather in 3 days, right? So nobody lived more than 3 days away. And now they all come and they gather together and they decide, okay, here's the decision. Everybody's got to come, all these foreign wives. What are we going to do? They're just going to walk in the door over there and everybody who's married to a foreign woman, we're going to say, you're divorced, we'll give you a certificate of divorce, send you all away and your children. Is that what they did? How long would that take? Do you understand how many people are listed in that reading that was done? Have you ever looked at those names and counted them? We're talking about almost 50,000 men who are of marriage age. 50,000. That's about the size of our whole Christadelphian community worldwide. 50,000. 50,000. How many people had married a foreign wife in the end and had to put them away? Do you have any idea? You read the list. How many of you think were in the list? Were there 300? Did he read 300? No. Did he read 200? No. Did he read 100? That's too small. There's 113 cases. That's all. Out of 50,000 people, you look at our community today, we have a lot more than 113 cases. Why did they think it was such a big issue? Because what they must have done, brothers and sisters, is the very thing we would do today as an arranging board. They passed a resolution that we've got to clean up the community. We don't want to go through this experience again of being carried off away. We've got to force people, help people make a decision. What do you want to do? And they interviewed. Did you realize how long this took? Did they do a policy where everybody showed up in 3 days? They all walked through the door and they all wrote certificate of divorces and were gone? How long did they spend? Did you notice that in the reading? See, that's the kind of thing we got to read carefully. How long did they spend investigating the cases? Did you read it? 3 months, 90 days. You don't need 90 days to just boot everybody out. They did what we would do. They talked to the brethren and the sisters. They talked to the husbands and wives, and they impressed upon them that, look, you have to make a decision. What are you going to do now? You got to make a decision. We passed a resolution that either you get on board as a family and you raise your children as Hebrews and you become part of this community, or it's time to separate. See, that was a great solution, but they didn't just kick them all out. They helped them make a better solution. In the end, there's only 113 cases of something that's such a huge problem. Ezra's pulling out his hair, he's crying out his eyes, and they all gathered together. And what they came up with is a solution that helped resolve the problem and get everybody back on track. But not the kind of thing we might do where we just pass a rule and boot people out. They must have taken the time to investigate them case by case with the intent of trying to win them over to the community. It's your last chance. We got to make a choice. And these are great stories of giving us hints about how people solve their problems. 113 men. So in the end, you realize, yes, the problem was widespread amongst the community. It was widespread in that sense. But there was a very low percentage of people that were actually affected. That's a pretty small percent when you look at 113 cases out of, you're dealing with almost 50,000 people. So we got to remember today that brothers and sisters, moms and dads, grandpas and grandmas, you are the ones responsible to be making these decisions for your children and for your ecclesia and for the children of your ecclesia. We have to pore over the scriptures and try to figure out what is God trying to tell us about how to resolve these issues? You know, it's not the kind of thing where just a couple people get together and say, here's the solution, and then they ram it down everybody's throats. That doesn't work. What Ezra did is he pulled everybody together, impressed them with, we have a problem, came up with a resolution that all of us, for the most part, can buy into, although there's 4 names listed that didn't agree with the solution. And the people together kept their unity, implemented the decision, and they moved forward in faith, trusting that God was going to work with this. So as we leave this weekend and you go back home to your homes and families and your ecclesias, let's make sure that we are willing to make those tough decisions. Look to the scriptures for guidance about how you make these decisions. Don't just look for passages that support what they did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or what your family always does. We have to try to figure out, what is God trying to tell us today that make good decisions for the sake of our children and our grandchildren? And think about this morning as we take the emblems. Look at what our great high priest has done for us. He listens to our concerns. He reads our thoughts and the intents of our heart. But he has compassion on all of us. Be thankful that he's gracious and he's merciful to forgive our sins for all the things we have done. You know, all the mistakes, the sins we have committed. He's a compassionate and merciful high priest. Be committed to show others in your family and your ecclesias that same mercy and compassion that he showed to us. I really think the people who realize how much Christ has forgiven them, then in turn realize how much we can forgive others. That's how Joseph forgave all his brothers. And pray for wisdom to make good decisions that promote unity in our families and our ecclesias. We don't know the answers. I don't know the answers. You don't know the answers. But we all pray for wisdom that when we come together, moms and dads in a family, you get together, husbands and wives, ecclesias, arranging boards, business meetings, whatever you do, you come together and pool that wisdom that God has given us and make decisions that the group can support. And give high priority to not just the moment of time, but look to the future. We want to leave an inheritance for our children. So let's leave here today committed to put the past behind. Whatever has gone on in your past, and learn from some of these stories to implement things maybe in a different way, and pray for God's help to do that. And thanks be to God this morning, who loves us all, and he wants us to be part of his family. Look at what he has done to bring us into his family, trying to teach us about his ways, leaving his book behind to tell us about his character, hoping that we'll grab a hold of that and try to implement it in how we treat one another. Thanks.